After the Civil War, Americans were happy with one another and completely at peace, and there were no more problems ever. Just kidding. There were a lot of problems, but there were also solutions. You'd think after war, the United States would be, united, but they were still divided on many socio-political topics, including universal suffrage. What was this topic that had people up in 19th century wool-sleeved arms? Just, everybody having the right to vote. There was a time when, being a democracy and giving everybody the right to vote was a spicy take. What made it so spicy? You guessed it, good old sexism and racism. But many women on both sides played instrumental roles in the journey towards suffrage. Welcome to Remedial Herstory, where we ask what happened to the women and put them in. In this series, we tell women's history from era to era from the perspectives of differing and diverse women. Women are half of history. Welcome to Her Story. This episode was sponsored by the South Carolina Humanities, the New Hampshire Women's Foundation, and the patrons of the Remedial Herstory Project. Post-Civil War, the United States was busy passing the Reconstruction Amendments. The 13th ended or abolished slavery in the United States. Sounds good. The 14th granted the full rights of citizenship to all formerly enslaved people and women who didn't previously have those rights. Okie dokie. But the 15th Amendment granted the right to vote to all men. Wait. Hold up! The 15th Amendment was controversial. Many abolitionists thought everyone should have the right to vote. But when push came to shove, Congress was just not ready to give the right to vote to black men and all women at the exact same time. Even progressive allies started to debate who should take priority, black men or women. If you think framing human rights as a contest sounds problematic and ignorant, you would be right. In 1866, at the close of the Civil War, women's rights and anti-slavery advocates, who pretty much were the same people anyway, joined together to form the American Equal Rights Association. They hoped that we could gain universal suffrage as a result of their efforts. But male leaders in the organization feared losing both battles if they kept the causes united. Sorry, women, better luck next time. Women's rights icon Susan B. Anthony and Frederick Douglass had been friends for years, but the 15th Amendment tested that friendship. Douglass went about the country making comments to the press that prioritized black male suffrage over women's suffrage. And Susan B. Anthony clapped back.
I will cut off this right arm of mine before I will ever work or demand the ballot for the Negro and not the woman.
Her friend Elizabeth Cady Stanton went further. In their suffrage newspaper, The Revolution, she described uneducated black men with racial slurs. Ooh, not a good look. Everything came to a head in 1869 at the annual meeting for the AERA. Newly revealed mean girls, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, were asked to resign on the grounds that their comments were not in the spirit of universal suffrage. Interestingly enough, Frederick Douglass defended Stanton as a friend to black people. But he did say that he didn't think there was the same urgency for women to get the ballot as there was for black men.
When women, because they are women, are hunted down through the cities, when they are dragged from their houses and hung up on lampposts, when their children are torn from their arms and their brains dashed out upon the pavement, when they are objects of insult and outraged at every turn, when they are in danger of having their homes burnt down over their heads, when their children are not allowed to enter schools, then they will have an urgency to obtain the ballot equal to our own.
Wow, now that was a nice mic drop. If there had been microphones around back then, there weren't. There was great applause, and an unknown female voice in the audience asked,
Is that not all true about black women?
Douglass responded,
Yes. It is true of the black woman, but not because she is a woman, but because she is black.
Susan B. Anthony was not impressed. She rebutted,
The old anti-slavery school say women must stand back and wait until the Negro shall be recognized. But we say, if you will not give the whole loaf of suffrage to the entire people, give it to the most intelligent first. Mr. Douglass talks about the wrongs of the Negro, but with all the outrages that he today suffers, he would not exchange his sex and take the place of Elizabeth Cady Stanton.
It's definitely not great that she inferred that black men weren't as smart as white women, but she had a point about universal suffrage. If we're being serious about universal suffrage, we shouldn't be leaving the women behind. Her remark about Douglas trading sex with Elizabeth Cady Stanton was met with great laughter, and that's when Lucy Stone stepped up. Stone from Massachusetts said,
"Mrs. Stanton will, of course, advocate for the preference for her sex, and Mr. Douglas will strive for the first position for his. And both are perhaps right. We are lost if we turn away from the middle principle and argue for one class."
Translation, we need to stop all this infighting and stay together. And she was right. Within a year, the 15th Amendment passed and made it completely legal to deny women the right to vote. The continuing debate about women's suffrage certainly did not clarify where women of color stood in this whole conversation, even though they had been integral to both the feminist and abolition movements from the beginning. One notable advocate for black women was Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. She consistently pointed out the plight that women of all races were in financially. Speaking from personal experiences, she described living in poverty after her husband passed away. And she explained that if women do not get the right to vote, any woman could be in her situation. Yet another mic drop. Or, to be historically accurate, perhaps a fiddle drop. Sojourner Truth, a former slave, also weighed in at a women's rights convention. She said,
"There is a great stir about colored men getting their rights, but not a word about the colored women. And if colored men get their rights and not colored women theirs, you see the colored men will be masters over the women, and it will be just as bad as it was before."
Very true. Listen, her name wasn't Sojourner Lies. Interestingly, newly forming states out west were willing to give women suffrage way before the states on the East Coast. Wyoming in 1890 became the first state to give women suffrage. The West may have been more open to women's rights for a variety of reasons. In some cases, male politicians might have realized women's significance in settling the frontier. Yes, Queen. In some states, giving women the right to vote may have helped solidify voting blocks. So basically, they were using women. It's not really yes, Queen, it's kind of the opposite, more like yes, pawn. In other places, people thought that more women might be drawn to these Western states if there were at least some rights available to them when they arrived. Anyway, as Western states considered women's suffrage for a variety of reasons, the East Coast remained stagnant. The women's movement split in two, with Stanton and Anthony founding the National Women's Suffrage Association, and Stone and Douglas founding the American Women's Suffrage Association. Both groups published newspapers and advocated for women's rights, but they differed in their approach and, of course, their support of the 15th Amendment. The NWSA lobbied for a federal amendment, while the AWSA went state to state. These divided suffrage organizations forced women across the country to choose a side. Charlie Lottie Rollin and her sister Frances were free black women born into wealth in Charleston, South Carolina. In 1869, Lottie gave an impassioned speech on the floor of the state legislature asking them to enfranchise women, becoming the first black woman in that state to do so. A New Hampshire husband and wife duo, Nathaniel and Armenia White, founded the state's suffrage association and kept suffrage in the newspaper long enough to get the state to consider suffrage on the state floor before it failed. By the 1870s, Anthony was frustrated, and she gave up on the legislative approach and moved towards the courts. In 1872, she and over a dozen women registered to vote in Rochester, New York. They were arrested, Susan B. Anthony was put in prison, and tried in the courts. She hoped that if the government as a whole wouldn't condemn the injustices against women, maybe an individual judge would. You can't blame her for trying, except that the courts did. She was convicted of violating state voting laws and fined $100. She never paid it. Similarly, a Missouri suffragist, Virginia Minor, tried to use the 14th Amendment to challenge her inability to vote in the state. She lost. In 1879, Frances Willard, the head of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the most powerful and largest women's movement of the time, endorsed suffrage, putting the full weight of that organization behind the suffrage cause. Heck yeah! Willard's stance was proof that sober people can definitely party. Great news, but bad news. The WCTU's support for suffrage eventually became problematic because the alcohol industry was worried that a bunch of women having the right to vote might prohibit the sale of alcohol in the United States. It might have seemed like sexists were the only people that didn't want women to have the right to vote, but then the entire alcohol industry was like, wait a second, hold my beer. By now you can tell the women's suffrage movement varied in strength from region to region, city to city, class to class. But are you ready for a shock? Elite white women were among the strongest opponents to women's suffrage. They benefited from the current system and the gendered privileges it allowed them. Why would they want to uproot it? What would a herstory lesson be without learning about the OG Karens? There was also a distinct difference between the Southern and the Northern anti-suffragists. While both tended to be white and wealthy, in the North, people were worried that the vote would politicize and corrupt women and take them away from their philanthropic and charitable responsibilities. Meanwhile, in the South, people were worried that if enough black women got the vote, it would disrupt white supremacy. That was their reason for opposing women's suffrage. They actually said those words out loud to people. One of the most famous female opponents to suffrage was a woman named Molly Elliott Sewell. She was an author and wrote prolifically against suffrage. She wrote a book in opposition to suffrage titled, "I have so much internalized misogyny, I have forced my self-hatred upon others." Just kidding. That's just what the book could have been called. The real title was The Woman's Battle. In it, she argued,
"It has often been pointed out that women could not, with justice, ask to legislate upon matters of war and peace, as no woman can do military duty. But this point may be extended much further. No woman can have any practical knowledge of shipping and navigation, of the work of trainmen on railways, of mining, or of many other subjects of the highest importance. The entire execution of the law would be in the hands of men, backed up by an irresponsible electorate which could not lift a finger to apprehend or punish a criminal. And if all the dangers and difficulties of executing the law lay upon men, what right have women to make the law?"
Cliff Notes version, women don't get to do a lot of stuff, so why should they have any say in all the stuff they're not allowed to do? The logic is shaky at best, especially when you consider that poor women were doing some of those jobs. But it resonated with a lot of people. Some anti-suffragists argued that if women had the right to vote, it would dismantle the home and erode womanhood. Like extra. Political cartoons of the era depicted men doing women's work. Oh no! Neglected homes or motherless children crying because there was no mother at home to take care of them. Others depicted women selfishly pursuing their own hobbies and interests at their family's expense. Women having interests and dreams outside of the home? The audacity! Ida Tarbell from Pennsylvania was the first investigative journalist. She exposed the corrupt business practices of John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company. She had a pretty nuanced anti-suffrage take. She really took issue with the idea that women were inferior because they were not allowed to vote. She said,
"A harmful and unsound implication in the suffrage argument has been that a woman's position in society would improve in proportion as her activities and interests become the same as those of men. This implies, of course, that man's work in society is more important than women's, but both are essential to society."
Tarbell herself was an accomplished woman. Why should she feel oppressed just because she didn't have the right to vote? Essentially, women are already the bomb.com. Why do they need the stinking ballot? Despite their opposition, the NWSA and the AWSA pressed on. In 1887, the NWSA proposed an amendment that actually made it to a vote. But 34 of the votes against women's suffrage came from the South. With this humiliating defeat, both groups decided enough was enough. They needed to meet to recalibrate their efforts. Anthony Stanton Stone, Stone's daughter Alice Stone Blackwell, and Rachel Foster met to put the past behind them. After long negotiations, they decided to work solely on women's suffrage, and they reorganized themselves as the National American Women's Suffrage Association, or NAWSA. Combined, NAWSA was able to put considerably more weight behind state suffrage movements, so state suffrage campaigns became incredibly powerful. For example, Virginia Durant from South Carolina transformed the suffrage cause in her state by publishing a weekly newspaper and quickly putting the full weight of NAWSA behind her. She and her allies worked tirelessly across the state, bringing in powerhouse speakers from NAWSA to rouse support for the suffrage cause. But alas, suffrage was about to hit a really deep dry spell. The narrow focus that NAWSA put on suffrage limited their ability to impact the full female experience. They did very little to address issues like racism, lynching, alcoholism, corrupt divorce and inheritance laws. However, because their aim was simplified, their membership grew from 7,000 to 2 million. Yet their singular goal remained incredibly distant, as Southern states still remained an incredible barrier, and kind of a huge bummer. If you can't beat them, join them isn't always the best approach, and yet that's the approach that Anthony and Stanton used to try to get momentum behind suffrage. They recruited prominent white suffragists from the South to come and join the national suffrage cause, and some of these Southerners were pretty problematic. Kate Gordon from Alabama became vice president of NAWSA and argued that white women in the South getting the right to vote could counterbalance black male suffrage in the South. So she was racist. She was not alone. Laura Clay from Kentucky and Belle Kearney from Mississippi also made these sort of arguments. Many Southern white women were just plain uncomfortable working alongside their black sisters. NAWSA? More like nah, say less. Meanwhile, white Southern society clung to gendered expectations of women, believing that the right to vote would damage their status as good Southern women. In 1895, NAWSA held their annual convention in Atlanta, Georgia, at the urging of Augusta Howard. Howard believed that Southern states would continue to insist that Southern women did not want the vote until they saw a bunch of Southern women rallying to the suffrage cause. Characteristic of a lot of Southern suffrage events, no black women were invited to the annual convention that year. And importantly, Frederick Douglass, who had been a staple at every annual convention up to that point, was asked not to attend. Racist. It goes without saying that this behavior from NAWSA, to use the correct historical term, was stupid. Black women remained members of NAWSA, but in addition to fighting against sexism, they had to fight against racism internally as well. They consistently advocated for NAWSA to support the anti-lynching cause. Thankfully, throughout the 1890s, black women's clubs started to pop up all around the country to take on issues like lynching that women's organizations wouldn't. Ida B. Wells Barnett from Memphis, Tennessee, and later Chicago, used her platform as a journalist to push black women towards these causes. From Memphis, Tennessee, Terrell was one of the first African-American women to earn a college degree. The motto of these newly united black women's clubs was "Lifting as we climb," symbolizing the double oppression of African-American women living in the United States and fighting for suffrage. These women were super inspiring. Terrell understood that black women were in a unique position and they could not simply focus on suffrage. They had to focus on a myriad of social issues that were impacting their communities. She gave a passionate speech at the 1898 NAWSA annual convention. She said,
"Not only are colored women with ambition and aspiration handicapped on account of their sex, but they are almost always everywhere baffled and mocked because of their race."
And that's what we call facts right there. After petitioning NAWSA for years to create subcommittees that worked towards the concerns of African American women, Terrell decided to focus on the Black Club movement. When the first wave of women suffragists died in the early 1900s, only 4 states had given women the right to vote: Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, and Idaho. 50 years and 4 states. Yikes. Black women were increasingly battling for a place in the conversation, while Indigenous and Asian women weren't even considered citizens at this time. Yeah, remember them, Indigenous and Asian women? Society didn't. As Herstory would prove, it would take an entirely new generation of women from a variety of backgrounds to finally achieve a suffrage amendment. By the end of the era, so much remained in question. Did the divisions between the NWSA and the AWSA cost women years of opportunities? Was the racist and political maneuvering in order to win the Southern states worth it? What lasting impact would the ostracization of black women within the movement have on the overall impact of the movement? Why was progress so slow to come? And how many more organizations with confusing capital letters have to form before the suffrage amendment could finally be passed? Thanks for watching. If you want to dive deeper, head over to our website, www.remedialherstory.com. You can find lesson plans, primary sources, video recommendations, and so much more. Let's make herstory.